In this video I will be talking about the idea of integration and oppositional culture, and lastly cultural appropriation, and why I think that integration and mass migration generally are a bad idea, but from the sense of they're not just a bad idea for the host country, but as much so for the people coming into the new country. Let's assume we have two countries, A and B. Both are inhabited by blue people. Both of the countries are mostly blue. In that case, if one of them goes to the other country, he has incentive to integrate. After he integrates, he will be considered part of the community and will have a sense of community and belong in the new community. In this sense, for example, let's say you have a Polish person which moves to the UK. If they fully embrace British culture, learn how to talk with the local accent, maybe they themselves will never be fully British, but their children very likely will, which we see in many ways in the Americas, where you have people with Polish surnames, which they themselves can't even properly pronounce because they have fully integrated. But let's look at another scenario. In this case, the people of country B are natively green. In that case, blue person coming into this country can't truly integrate ever. Imagine you're, for example, this blue person. You move into a country that's green. You learn all the customs, how they speak, how they behave, what they like, stuff like that, and you embrace that wholeheartedly. The immediate reaction of any green person will at any point be recognizing that you're blue and that's not green. This too is not very much so a problem if there's only a few blue people. If you are the only blue person, you will still find some sense of belonging by integrating into the culture. That's because, well, there's no real choice. You are the only blue person. Either you partly belong to the new culture or you have no place of belonging. The third option is mass migration of blue people to green country, of blue people to a blue country. If blue people of the A country group, let's mark A with a red color then, migrate to the other country, they then have the dilemma whether to integrate or not. If you step out of the bubble of your own culture and integrate, you do find a new community where you will very likely be accepted, because after enough practice, you will not be able to be really told apart at first glance from the locals. But you could possibly be seen as a traitor by the other fellows of your nation. Something like that certainly happens to Polish people which move abroad and change their names to German ones because they feel more German than Polish. There is no hatred for them from Polish people, but there is certainly a level of you're a traitor, stuff like that. And then that you need to weigh out the pros and cons. Do you wish to be accepted by wider culture, but possibly less so accepted by your family, or the other way around? And in praxis we see that this depends on whether or not there's any form of discrimination or stuff like that. And there also exists the possibility of an integrated identity. An example for an integrated identity would be Irish Americans. Irish Americans are in no way Irish. If they go to Ireland, they're just considered annoying because they're Americans to the Irish. In the US though, they are a distinct group to themselves with their own somewhat unique customs, but they are unmistakably American. That's because they can both easily act completely American and somewhat preserve their own heritage, one could say. Okay, another scenario that can happen, of course, is the mass migration of people from the blue country to a country full of green people. In this case, there is close to zero benefit from a blue person becoming part of the green community. That is because becoming green, quote unquote, will not only be impossible for them because they will always be recognized as not green, but they also will potentially be seen as a traitor by their fellow blues which migrated into the country. In other words, this leads to a complete state of isolation. We can see that most predominantly amongst Indians and Pakistanis in the UK, where you have for example, that Prime Minister from the SNP who says that Scotland is too white. He is a Pakistani man living in a country with a 0.01% Pakistani population, yet he still managed to, for example, find a Pakistani wife. That is because the very idea of integrating would be a very big mistake for him. He will never be recognized as Scottish by just looking at it. But if he tried to integrate into Scottish society, he would also be recognized as not Indian and not Pakistani, using that identity. And this is further exacerbated by the celebration of not being the local thing and being someone from somewhere else. And then we have a last possible scenario. That is, what if you just have one country? Just the country, you have a country which has both blue and green people in it. Say the country has both blue and red people from it. The red people came to the country a long time ago and thus don't have really a distinct identity of their own. Because of a lack of a separate identity, you would assume a new identity among the two groups would form, and they would just be B people. But that's not what we see historically happen at all. While both groups might consider themselves B people, so in this case let's say Swiss or American, because one of the groups is distinctly green and one is distinctly red, two separate identities will be developed. One which can be described as the culture and the other as the oppositional culture. Now let's look at this with the example of the United States of America, because this was avoided in Switzerland, for example. Because whites are considered the quote-unquote dominant group in that country, they are larger in population and have historically been the majority of the presidents and the majority of the rich people and inventors, the majority of the army, stuff like that. Innately American values such as being a Protestant work ethic, dressing a certain way, they are considered American. For a long time you needed to conform to these values to be considered American. On the other hand, oppositional culture, which is a term by the way coined by African Americans, refers to the fact of shaping your self-identity and group identity in opposition to the predominant group. In the US that has materialized in the form of rap, seeing being on time as nerdy and stuff like that. Oppositional culture is the predominant theory in the US used to explain why black people underperform in education. The theory goes like this. You have a black kid and he has good grades and becomes ostracized by his peers for quote-unquote acting white. There's a lot of support for that theory, I think. One of the pieces is the fact that we can observe that while American culture has spread throughout the world, oppositional culture of the US has spread just as much. Arguably second generation Turks in Germany, second generation Pakistanis in the UK, second generation Arabs in Sweden, and second generation Algerians in France all have one odd thing in common. One is gang culture and rapping. Swedish Arab rap, German Turkish rap, and French immigrant rap are all a thing. Whereas a very, we could say, leftist worldview, the way Americans dress and stuff like that has become the predominant thing also in Western countries. This means that nearly like societal castes in India, people who look distinct from the main societal group to have an and thus can't immediately be identified as part of that group will develop an oppositional culture, which means a culture which has values which define themselves in opposition to the main culture. Out of that, two more phenomena emerge, and that is deconstruction and cultural appropriation. Deconstruction is the dissolution of the main culture. For example, making what it is to be British not associated with anything native to England, but rather to make the main predominant culture an umbrella term under the identity of English or British. An example for that again is the Americas, where you have Italian Americans, Irish Americans, and let's say Dixies and Yankees, who all solidly fall under the category of American, while somewhat being their own distinctive thing. Another one would be the Swiss, where you have French Swiss, Italian Swiss, and German Swiss, which are very protective of their culture to the point where if you speak Italian in the German part, even if the other person does speak Italian, they might completely refuse to speak to you like that. The problem with that, of course, is that identities like German, English, etc., they do exist. So by deconstructing the term English and trying to make it broader, you push the people who are the English into a much more narrow category, which now needs to define themselves in many ways by something else, which is a hard transition process, because they don't really have another thing to identify themselves with, which ironically might lead to a rise of pan-nationalist ideologies, such like, let's for example say white nationalism, because if you are not English, if English is the umbrella for everyone, what are you? You are white English or white. The second concept is cultural appropriation. Oddly enough, the cultures which are the most, you could say, artificial, like for example African American culture, which is basically solely an oppositional culture to American culture, because very little was brought over from Africa to the US. The weakest cultures, so those that are most defined by being oppositional, in this case for example African Americans, who brought over very little from Africa, and thus are close to solely defined by their opposition to the main culture, are thus the most fragile or most opposed to cultural appropriation. Why so? That's of course because if they define their in-group by certain traits which are opposite to the traits of the out-group, and the out-group adopting their traits, such as, for example, liking rap, liking baggy clothing, adopting dreads, this once again puts them at a situation where they don't have their own identity. They're becoming the victim of the deconstruction immigrant groups try to perform on the main group. Because if their identity is defined by opposition to the main group, if the main group adopts their identity, they once again don't have one of their own, because they will be not immediately recognized as part of the main group anyway. And at the end of the day, I do think every multiracial society that will eventually result in either the emergence of a caste system through the creation of an umbrella culture, like in India, where you have the multiple castes, where the Brahmins from the very north and the Brahmins for the very south are closer related to each other than a Brahmin and a Dalit from the south. Whereas the other option is just national divorce or collapse of the nation, which, if I had to guess an example, would be the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Even though it was a multicultural state, with Lithuanians, Poles, Jews, Tatars, Ukrainians, Ruthenians, etc., the main culture and the main culture group of the state was Polish. And when the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth fell, the only people who fought for the restoration of that state were the Poles. There weren't Germans fighting to restore Poland, there weren't Jews fighting to restore Poland, there weren't Lithuanians fighting to restore Poland. It was only the Polish people, because at the end of the day it was only their country, and the rest of the people considered themselves maybe sympathetic to Poland, maybe partly integrated in Poland, but at the end of the day they had their own identity, which they didn't, and thus didn't feel much attachment to the country in itself or its wider culture.